If you want to vote during this debate, you will have to have the guidebook app. So now is the time to load it onto your phone. Your instructions are in the front page of your program, and the Wi-Fi code is right here, so you have everything you need. Open the guidebook app, and you will go to this session, the debate, and you will be able to vote. During the debate, you will see live results up here. So now is the time. You can vote on your own.
Well, let's face it, we'll neutralise. We can all agree not to vote, but would neutralise. Before you got here, Henrik, we agreed.
Here, go to the App Store, get Guidebook, download that. At the very top of Guidebook, once you've launched it, it will say, use passphrase. The passphrase is CIPRI 2017. Click that, and then download, it's all one word, download the program for this event. We're now testing our debaters in real time. We'll wait just a minute for people to come in from lunch. There's plenty of seats down here at the front. This is an interactive session.
We need your vote. Download the app.
Got it? Oh, it's loading. Yeah. 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 So in the course of the debate, you will be answering the same question. You, the audience, are going to be answering the same question 3 times. Do you agree with the statement, the affirmative statement that's listed in the program? I'll read it off here. Multilateral commitments like the New Deal, the SDGs, and the Paris Climate Accord are relevant and applicable in 2017. So you will vote on that 3 times, once at the beginning, once in the middle to see if you've been swayed by our debaters' arguments, and then you will vote again at the end. So you'll have 3 chances to weigh in on your position on multilateral commitments. I think we've got a critical mass. There's enough people here, a couple people still coming in, but we can go ahead and start. So I want to welcome you all. Thank you for coming to this plenary session. We're going to have a debate. And I really want to thank both Safer World, and Larry has been a co-conspirator on this. But I want to thank our panel here for agreeing to do this, because this is quite adventurous. We've agreed that this is a debate. We know all of us, everyone in the room is used to getting around a table and trying to find consensus, trying to get agreement on these things. And I've challenged them and said, let's really argue this out. So take a position. We have the pro side. We have Habib Rahman Mayer, the Deputy Secretary from G7+, who will be arguing in the affirmative. We have Dr. Aaron McCandless, a scholar and practitioner from the New School and director of the Forging Resilient Social Contracts program. And we have Henrik Hammergrund, the executive director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, all 3 of which have agreed to argue the affirmative. They are arguing that multilateral commitments like the New Deal, the SDGs, and the Paris Climate Accord are relevant and applicable in 2017. Now, there may be some people that still question that wonder about that, given the current geopolitics. And so we have a con team that's arguing against this. Very kindly, Harriet Lamb, Chief Executive Officer of International Alert, has agreed to argue against. Larry Attree, Head of Policy, Safer World, has agreed to argue against. And Ottilia Munganitsi, I got it, Head of Special Projects, Institute for Security Studies, has agreed to argue against. And so we're very happy to have both sides represented by actual debate. I want to clarify a couple of ground rules before we get started. This is not for attribution. As I just said, it is not necessarily the case that the people that are sitting up here believe in the thing that they are arguing. So do not go out there afterward and tweet, "You won't believe this thing that Harriet just said." They are arguing a particular side. And remember that they're not trying to find consensus, right? So this is not our usual standard operating procedure. I also want to point out that I'm going to be very strict on time. We have agreed on time for both sides. We've conferred on the rules, and everybody has agreed. There's only one talking stick, the microphone. It's going to start over here in the affirmative. They're going to have 6 minutes for their opening statements. That's between their teams, so they're going to have to decide how they split that up and pass the mic. But when they are done, I have a bell, and I am not afraid to use it. And lastly, I just want to remind people that we are not arguing the actual commitments. We are not arguing about the merits and strengths of the SDGs, of the New Deal, of the Paris Climate Accord. What we are arguing is about whether multilateral commitments like those, in the spirit of those, have the same relevance today as they did a year ago when a lot of these agreements were made. That's the question, right? So that's the debate that's happening right now. So without further ado, I will give 6 minutes to the affirmative side. No, I won't yet. First, it's time for the first audience poll. So for those of you who have downloaded the guidebook app, go to the debate session, scroll down to the bottom, and you will now see a poll that is live and open. And we already have votes coming in. There are 12 votes in the affirmative, 5 votes against. Oh, it's changing, it's moving. Great. So we have about 20. Isn't that exciting? I mean, that's fantastic. So if you missed out on that, you can still download the guidebook app and you can join us for round 2 of voting. But we're going to close voting now. This is the final position, 67 for, 33% against. There was a little push at the end there. We're going to close it now. Madeline's got it. And we are now going to go 6 minutes for the affirmative in favor. And I give it to you.
Thank you. So I'm privileged to go first on this very interesting topic. First of all, I'm not a historian, but forgive me if I mention this like as a misfact. If we did not have the multilateral system, we would have gone into a global disaster caused by nuclear war after Second World War. So that is the history. But now what it means to us, the fragile and conflict-affected countries. We are fragile because of, not only because of our own wrong policies, but also because of a very complicated international complicated systems. And we need multilateral system to fix that. And this includes not only the conflict, the violence, but also the climate changes. Just very specifically the examples, our countries are naturally rich. They are rich by nature. And the extraction of those natural resources by the North through this, again, very complicated international economic system has made us fragile. So that's why we need a multilateral system as, you know, a framework like the New Deal and the SDGs to work, to solve our problems. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to build upon that, we want to start, a key argument we want to make is that multilateralism is necessary. It's necessary and it's served global development in very powerful ways. And yet we also can recognize it's necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? With it, we need leadership, innovation, creativity. We know that problems and challenges and conflicts and environmental crises are not trapped within borders. They expand beyond borders. Therefore, it's purely logical that we would need approaches and responses that are multilateral in nature. And we do need the creativity. We need leadership because, for example, the climate treaty, other multilateral agreements we know are just floors. They're not ceilings. They don't go far enough. So we have to buttress these with innovation and leadership and creativity. Multilateralism has been, you know, probably two key challenges that need improving on it are around leaving no one behind and issues of sustainability. And we point to these new agreements, I mean, the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, New Deal, and so forth. all target these key issues that multilateralism has been weak and in the past, and not, as a result, has not fairly distributed the results of multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you, and perhaps then to add on, and I think actually one argument is also what's is a paraphrasing a little bit about the theme of this year's forum. It's actually because it works. We know it works. If we look back historically, international agreements have changed the world. It has tied us to various commitments in various systems. Without going into the details, it doesn't matter if we look at international health campaigns, if we look at the advancing women's rights, or the whole human rights agenda, international humanitarian law, how it was set up, how it was developed. We know this is a system that can mobilize support, that can advocate issues, increase knowledge, and also, perhaps more important, set international frameworks, international standards. We know it not only from this kind of work, but we know it from other fields. Be it the international production lines for companies, following safety regulations, other international standards. So why wouldn't it work in the field of development? Why would it not work in the field of peace and security? And why not now? Well, one issue there, I guess, it's linked to leadership, as was mentioned. Leadership without commitments is not leadership. That's opportunism. And we see that as a very negative and a very dangerous trend. So, although perhaps the frameworks we have is not entirely successful in all areas, they're there to guide us. They're there to mobilize support, mobilize resources, but they're also there to set up the frameworks for which we can hold parties accountable to international agreed norms and standards that are absolutely essential. And let's not forget that that is actually what created the UN as such. It's we the peoples. It's an international framework of norms and accountability. And of course, it's never better than the parties commit themselves to. So we need to hold them accountable. We need to continue to monitor, to develop resources, and also to develop the skills and data to actually confirm progress or negative trends. So with these arguments, I think we are about to conclude, and we have another 20 seconds if you would like to add something.
Just to add as an example, the recent refugee crisis, it's not only our issue now, no more. It is a global issue. So to resolve that, to address that, we need multilateral commitment coming out of multilateralism to solve these issues. We cannot solve it by our own. No one can solve this by their own, unless we all commit multilaterally. Thank you.
And that's the bell.
Very good. Very good. You beat the bell. And now we will pass it over to the Khan, and we have an additional time for the Khan to be able to respond, because this is a rebuttal, and they will now both present their opening statements and their responses to some of these arguments. They'll have 12 minutes, and the timer is starting now.
Okay, so if we think of ourselves as little piggies, our house of straw may have just about weathered what we've faced so far, but really, I mean, the wolves or the Wolfowitzes are coming for us, and we can't be content to rely on tools which we can see are not up to the job of the current storm. We're clearly into a period where the laws of war, the laws on arms control, norms like the SDGs are no longer being respected, and there's a different world of contests out there which is shaping current history and the way conflicts are going. As peace builders, we need to be part of that history and not standing on the sidelines trying to use tools which aren't going to be effective. In November last year, the Saudi ambassador to the US was asked, will you continue to use cluster bombs in Yemen? And in reply, he quipped, this is like the question, will you stop beating your wife? In January 2017, the Security Council received a report from experts it had appointed detailing how the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen had attacked a community hall, killing hundreds of people, attacked hospitals, attacked residential areas in the country, and the evidence on this has been fairly continually flowing from the beginning of the regional campaign in Yemen. They considered the attacks to be potential war crimes, and of course, last year was also a year in which the UN caved into political pressure to remove the regional coalition in Yemen from a list of states and armed groups that violate children's rights in conflict. It was also a year in which 2 permanent members of the Security Council that had been receiving that evidence and those reports, the UK and the US, sold a combined $2.7 billion in arms to Saudi Arabia. So the point is that global norms no longer matter to those who are shaping today's conflict. If we think about the US missile strikes on Syria on the 6th of April, are these evidence of the continued power of the CCW? For me, they're more an indicator of the important power of CNN. In fact, when international norms have collided with the sort of political momentum behind things like the global war on terror, we see that they're no longer applied. For years, Bashar al-Assad in Syria has cut through the laws of war by actually feeding the initially peaceful rebellion with fundamentalists from Syrian prisons, and by starving and brutalizing the peaceful opposition so that the only people who could survive were predatory armed groups. The only moment when he has been confronted is based on the sensation created by the chemical attack, which led to CNN capturing the imagination of the US president. And it's not that it's a desirable universe in which this is the only international effort to stand up to Assad. It's just a fact that it is only in the court of public opinion and by appealing to the self-interest of the leaders who are shaping contemporary history that we can walk back towards adherence to international law. As peace builders, we have to be doing that. But what we are very poorly equipped to do also is to be getting out there into the debate and communicating with people who don't share our views. And social media constitute us into groups of those who are like-minded and agree with us, but we're not going to build peace if we stay in those communities. We need to be thinking and acting differently.
Thanks, Larry. We actually didn't expect to win that first vote. Not because we're not right. Actually, we are right. But because we know you're all such lovely, kind, sweet people, that you're so committed to multilateralism, that you're staying in your happy little Swedish bubble, convinced that that is the way forward, without looking out of the window. I don't know if you've noticed, but Trump is back to gunboat diplomacy. Even if the gunboats are going in the wrong direction, or perhaps it's Twitter gunboat diplomacy. And you only have to look at me and Larry, we're both from Britain, just to remind you about the state of the world. People are retreating back into their splendid isolation of their nations. And that is the brutal reality that we all need to face up to. Because, in fact, it's not that we are against multilateralism. Not at all. We're in favor of multilateralism of the right kind, and we'd better face up to the realities if we want to defend it, instead of skipping along thinking that all is right with the world. And why? Why has there been such a turning of the back of the world on multilateral commitments? Why have we seen that? And I think there's 3 very strong arguments. The first one is that these multilateral institutions are not working. They are not seen to deliver the collective action that is more than the individual nation can do. You only have to look at the so-called Doha development round that the WTO promised for years and years and which has never come into being. You only have to look at the constant failure of the United Nations Security Council to even begin to address the root causes of conflict, let alone bring about regional peace and security. And so they have no legitimacy, they're not working. Secondly, as Aaron so powerfully said, people are left behind. The multilateral institutions are out of touch. They're out of touch with the majority of the world's population in the way they work and in how they work and in the decisions they come to that go on and on supporting the powerful and the wealthy. And thirdly, as Larry says, multilateralism's on decline because we're not out there making the case because we're so busy thinking it's all right and that they're perfect and they're going to survive. But out there are people making brutal and tough arguments in favor of national self-interest. And so we need to be out there making those arguments too. Politicians can't be leaders. As you mentioned, leadership. Politicians can't be too far away from their people. The people have to support them and give them the backing to take big, brave decisions. And so we need to be out there supporting them too.
I'm almost tempted to say, well, our job is done. I was also tempted to start with a quote, if at all that exists, from Donald Trump. But I'm not from a country perceived to be a powerful state, nor am I from a country whose president people read their tweets from or listen to. I come from the great Republic of Zimbabwe. If you ask me what multilateralism means to me, if you ask me what multilateral commitments have done, not for the country, but for the people within the confines of Zimbabwe, I'll ask you, you tell me, since you're bringing up the big words, the long words, the words that tell me that you're committed to doing anything in respect of what's happening within my country, within my sub-region, within my continent, and perhaps even for those from my continent who choose that even though I cannot swim, I must leave. So we can talk about multilateral commitments from a purely academic point of view. We can talk about them from the point of view that they are principles. I love principles. We can talk about them in terms of these are our values. Values mean nothing if people do not act consistent to those values. Whether it is multilateral, whether it is bilateral, whether it is regional cooperation, regional work, it's all nice and good if you put it on paper. It looks a hell of a lot different if you try to actually do it. It looks a hell of a lot different if you say to someone, because of a multilateral commitment, maybe in 2063, I'm sorry, African Union, you too, you will achieve all the wonderful things we say you will achieve. To me, commitment is not just about saying we have a deal. Commitment goes beyond signing the agreement. It goes beyond saying this is what we plan to do. Commitment is action. So when I think about whether multilateralism is failing or not, I often wonder whether it ever succeeded. Maybe it did for the US, but I'm not a trumpeter and I never will be. Maybe it did for the great, can I still say that? Great Britain?
If you have to.
Maybe it did for kingdoms somewhere in Europe, in Swaziland, in Lesotho. Maybe it did for them. But the question isn't whether us, well, I'm not in a suit, some are, whether what the people in suits say is what the people in suits do, and whether the beneficiaries of what they say they plan to do actually ever get to understand what multilateralism is. I don't need a long word, I need action.
Some very strong words, some very big challenges back to the pro team. You don't get to vote yet. You now have to, now we're going to hear the response from the pro team. You are now rebutting what you have heard, and you're making your solid case at this point. So you have a little bit longer time, 16 minutes, and I'll start the clock now. If you don't use all of the time, any time you don't use, I'll take away from them too. So that way it'll keep us so that we have time for question and answer. Or you're welcome to give it to them if you'd like to do more. You have 16 minutes starting now.
Thank you. I may come again back because, thank you for giving me the chance. what I've been hearing is questioning the legitimacy of the multilateralism. And I will start with, my sister from Zimbabwe. We are far left behind. The race has gone ahead of us. And what it implies that if you do not, the only window for us to knock on is the multilateral commitment that we have to inspire. If we believe that the multilateralism has failed and it's no more legitimate, so then what happens? I mean, these are the scary images that is going on in my mind. First of all, the world, the superpowers, I would say, they are well equipped with any kind of, nuclear weapons that can just kill us. We will be just grinded under the shoes of there. Secondly, if we do not have multilateral commitments, Saudi will keep, doing what it has been doing in Yemen. If we do not have multilateral commitment, or if we stop believing in the multilateral systems, you can expect, things going on in North Korea, and you can expect these, giant powers doing whatever they do. Yes, it may not be relevant and legitimate to the strong powers, but it is relevant to us because we don't have any other door to knock on. And secondly, all this mess that has been created, take the example of climate changes. Alone, I mean, our countries, or no one, even US, UK, or France, no one can solve it because national interests are dictated and guided by the national interest. They are dictated by the national greed. So if we do not, take care of others, we will be guided by what our national interests tell us. And now our national interests tell us, that there will be no respect for human rights, there will be no consideration for the environment, there will be no consideration for others as long as they benefit us. Thank you.
Okay, some tough arguments, and appreciate the passion with which they were delivered as well. So I want to start just by asking a question, which is, do we think that colonialism would have been fully dismantled if it hadn't been for human rights and for how the multilateral system was able to promote and catalyze human rights across the world? So I think that's an important question. And also, my sister, is it Utilia from Zimbabwe? Am I saying it wrong? Okay. I think Zimbabwe is a phenomenal example for illustrating where the multilateral system did fail Zimbabweans. And I think it illustrates how multilateralism has increased and improved over the last several decades. I mean, even in terms of looking at how peace settlements, political settlements were made. This is 1980 in Zimbabwe, right? And it didn't address the root causes at all. The Lancaster Agreement fully tailored itself to keeping the former colonists in economic power, right? By ensuring that land could not be redistributed. So as well, the decades after that, you had World Bank and IMF policies that were promoting, structural adjustment at a time when actually what new anti-colonial governments needed across Africa was to be able to have a Marshall Plan, right? So there needed to be a different system in place to help ensure that decolonization could really work and that newly independent countries could succeed. So now we see both in the the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions on sustaining peace, we see advances in the UN fully embracing and accepting. Sure, it will be challenging to see how it's implemented, no doubt, but accepting the principle of addressing root causes and building national ownership around how peace can actually be sustained and how conflict can be prevented. So I think we have to notice how the multilateral system has improved in ways that really should be going in the direction that we need to go collectively. I think that one other point I want to make is, because I'm American, I can speak about Trump quite openly, I hope. And you can certainly Twitter it as well. I Twitter at him all the time. But I would say that, populism, we know is a challenge for multilateralism, or it's presented in this manner. But we also have to understand, and getting back to your point, Larry, about really trying to engage and engage with different types of non-state actors. I think that the existing populism today gives us a chance to do this, and we have to harness what is positive in populism. And one of the things I think we put it aside too much by saying, oh, it's all focused on bigotry and not wanting to to engage with the international or external communities. And I don't think it's all about that, actually. I think a lot of it is simply about not feeling heard. People want to feel the benefits and the results, the benefits from policies. So I think this is an important aspect of populism that we need to engage and embrace in our multilateralism. It gets back to that point I mentioned earlier about where multilateralism has been weak and needs to be further strengthened to fully succeed. Just on Trump, to add to that, I think that he also it's very illustrative. He has been anti-multilateralism, but pretty much every policy dialogue that he now starts engaging in, he's shifting his position and beginning to realize, oh, it's a little more complex than I thought. And this is important because he's pulling then with him a lot of the naysayers and people who didn't want to see any kinds of collaboration on particular issues. So we might end up seeing some, light come out of this darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Well, as somebody said, I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining why we're right. But I think there's a lot more to it than focusing on Trump. There's Front National, there's Swedish Democrats. This is a trend. It's, as I said, a very negative trend. And these elements or parties, they are the wrong answer to the right question. And the question is, why are so many excluded? And what can be done? What sort of frameworks shall we use to measure? And one can argue that, yes, this is academic, or this is only principles, but of course, human rights is a lot more than that. I just wonder what sort of human rights is not applicable to a woman or a girl child in Zimbabwe. Which one of them should we remove? So while I can agree that, of course, we need action, it's also important to know where action is not happening. Some of these frameworks actually is also a framework to be monitored to explain exactly that. What is not happening and why? Is it because lack of knowledge, lack of opinion, lack of resources? There are a lot of explanations, but we need also the indications on what is not happening. So frameworks is not only used for commitments, it's also to monitor what's not happening. There's a lot of other arguments. Of course, we can discuss the effectiveness of the United Nations system, and we can call it inefficient. Let's not forget that we're not talking about a greater staff than equivalent to Disney Worlds. We're not talking about a budget that it's only a couple of times bigger than the Tokyo police departments, or fire departments, I think it is. But there's so many other reasons to look at the efficiency of the UN system. And one is to look at the vulnerability. It's very easy for a single member state to actually cut funding to very core parts of a normative agenda, as was explained in the first panel, looking into sexual and reproductive healths. It's also very easy to criticize the UN because of the failure of the Security Council. But failure in the Security Council is not a failure of the UN, it's a failure of the Council. It needs to be addressed. The effects of them needs to be picked up, and is not being done by the belligerents. There were reference to how the combatants of today is not following the rules. Well, it's not for the belligerents, but it's for the victims that these norms and principles are in place. And it's from that we need to act. And I actually think it would be good to hand it back to you, Ahmed, to continue to build on that from the experience perhaps from Afghanistan, but also from the G7+, which is probably one of the most important development in this field, is the establishment of a group of countries that can express these core values from themselves, but also hold others accountable to support the right things, avoiding fragmentation at country level, avoiding the most difficult things to engage in, be it the political legitimacy, be it political processes, building up a rule of law system. Because what's the alternative to commitments? Is it to trust that the business community will sort it out? Is it to trust that states will automatically engage in what's needed at country level? I don't know, Hamid. What's your experience?
Thank you. And one of the explanation was that the multilateral or the global norms no more working. I mean, just building on the same side quote of the G7 plus, the very G7 plus, the establishment of it is a proof that it works. The multilateral commitment works. You know, we are cited as fragile states, and if you look at the definition which is offered by internationally, fragile state is something, like illegitimate institutions. Then usually the donors would apply that, okay, you don't need to talk to them because they know nothing. You have to go and dictate them. But today, I mean, this was the norms just before 2010 or 2011. But today, the same fragile states, or you call it conflict-affected states, weak states, or whatever you call them, they are sitting equally on the table and negotiating the norms and the terms of aid management, of intervention in these countries, which means they are manifesting their ownership. So that would be one of my explanations for that the multilateral systems work. In Somalia, if you would go before 2000, all the donors and everyone was fragmented and they were doing their own things. But now today we have the New Deal, which has harmonized all the actors, and they are speaking to the national realities based on the international commitments that were made to the New Deal, which is multilateral commitment. Now, all this wouldn't have been able to do it individually by one country. We have been engaged in these, discussion on aid effectiveness bilaterally with donors. We spent, days and nights, but it doesn't help unless we have multilateral commitment. One thing I would say that, yes, we can question whether it has worked or not, of how we can improve its efficiency or effectiveness, how we can improve the effectiveness of the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN. That is something which is subject to discussion. Of course, we agree that there are ways. And through this multilateral system of G7 plus, that's what we are negotiating now. And we see the value in multilateral commitments. But if we work on our own, I don't think so that we will be able to achieve those aspirations that we have been. And lastly, the SDGs, again, it's another example where, we all agree and we have all agreed on the minimum standard of, the services that all the countries are, supposed to be providing. Now, one thing that I would say is that, don't take me wrong, multilateralism or multilateral institutions like the UN or, the World Bank, if it has not achieved anything, but what it has achieved greatly is that now it has, promoted the sense of shame, You do not do wrong things because you have global forum where you can speak. Of course, back in home, you can be arrogant to, each other, to your neighbors, but, it has created that sense of solidarity, if I would say. Otherwise, the word is all, the countries or the constituent countries are all guided by their national interest. But where that global shame, where should that be? That is, I think, enabled by the multilateral systems. Thank you.
Good. Well, to conclude, then, I think I just think it's better to debate an issue with sort of without settling it, perhaps, but than to try to settle an issue without debating it. And commitments is about debating an issue without settling it, but it's trying to reach those standards that we can use.
Thank you. They were 1 minute lower. They saved 1 minute, so you also will be cut by 1 minute, and then we will go to question and answer with the audience. So now you have 9 minutes.
There's a certain arrogance in saying that these are the values and the principles that we all ascribe to simply because they are the values and principles to which you ascribe, and therefore you presume that, yes, this is good, I am right. And we're not supposed to reach an agreement in this particular debate, but perhaps in moving towards understanding the different perspectives that are there, you often also have to take a step back and say, maybe I'm not right. And I speak not so much as, speaking not just as a Zimbabwean, but quite prominently as an African as well. There was mention around the United Nations Security Council and this fanciful idea that you can extricate it from the UN system, and then the UN system is sparkly without the UN Security Council. What the UN Security Council, in a very small way, tells us is where one of the major challenges of the multilateral system is. It is uneven in power, in practice, in politics. So if the UN Security Council, with just 15 member countries, is unable to agree on a particular thing that relates to something that we can all see, such as in Syria, how do 203 countries get there? And it's not to say that people should not speak to each other. It is to say that you do not look at a system and say, it is dysfunctional, but we can fix it. You ask yourself whether in its creation it was dysfunctional, and whether a new system that needs to be created takes into cognizance the fact that what was there was not working. The UN Security Council cannot be removed from the United Nations because the UN Security Council is a key component of what is the United Nations. It speaks to the peace, the international stability, to the security. It speaks to issues around, even now, the conversations on the African continent that are going on about the International Criminal Court. We're not fighting justice. It's the UN Security Council that you cannot remove from the UN.
Well, I'm a bit confused about your arguments, because it seemed to me you argued actually what we would agree with. If you take the example of Saudi Arabia's acting with impunity in Yemen, if you take the example of North Korea, if you take the example of national greed trumping multilateral commitments, I think they're all arguments that the multilateral institutions are not relevant or applicable in 2017. If you look at the work of the World Bank and the IMF failing the poor, if you look at the fact that people feel they're not heard, if you look at the fact the United Nations is weak and underfunded, and that you cannot separate the most important body, the Security Council, from the legitimacy of the whole of the United Nations, then I think you're arguing again that those institutions are not relevant and applicable today. And when you talk about a sense of shame, I think, sadly, that is what is completely lacking. You only have to look at what's happening in Syria while the world stands by to see that the multilateral institutions are incapable of dealing with the complexity of the issues, and people feel no shame in Korea, in Ukraine, in North Korea, in Syria, Turkey, country after country after country feels no shame. Zimbabwe, to be another example. And it's absolutely not multilateralism that has ever solved these problems. If you look at colonialism, that wasn't multilateralism that solved colonialism. It was the struggles of the people within each of those independent countries against the colonial powers. That's what ended colonialism. And so I think in the same way, we need, as people, to be struggling for a new type of multilateral institution that could once again be applicable and relevant today.
Here. I just want to sort of point out a few of the ways in which the current approach to multilateral norms is also really not up to the job. So one of the arguments we heard was that one way forward is to use what we have but appeal to populism and make multilateralism popular again. But I don't think what we see in, for example, the SDGs or the New Deal is a formula that can capture the public imagination. When The Economist, I think, turned up to the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, they just looked at what was there and said, these are stupid development goals. So there's a degree in which we're not facing the reality of what, how people are actually thinking through issues and connecting to their conversations, and we need to change that. The contention that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the new multilateral architecture had kept us from another World War III is one way of spinning things, but I think what really prevented World War III was the fact of mutually assured destruction, which is people looking at their enlightened self-interest, which is again what we're saying we need to appeal to, that realpolitik, if we're to really work on peace going forward. Another question, I mean, how much do the SDGs matter? So I don't think they say substantively that much more than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights originally did. So why were they created if it wasn't the case that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights wasn't losing traction and relevance, and we had to have another process to try and assert that the norms are the right norms? Obviously, some states are using from a very broad agenda and the phenomenon of SDG dressing. So some states sort of saying, well, look at all this wonderful stuff we're doing, the SDGs, we're moving forward, but we know what the reality is in some of the places that have been mentioned as going backwards in the vision that's in the SDGs. Another thing you could say is that the international norms we have are a very state-centric vision of what peace building should be. We buy the consensus that they create between states by not talking about conflict in certain ways, not calling abuse and corruption and exclusion what they are in such clear terms as we should. We're not having the conversation through things like the New Deal also about Western aggression in the way that we should be. So it is quite an exclusive vision ultimately of what peace building should be about, and not as good a one as it could be. I think the other problem around the norms we have is the kind of template approach. And we saw, I mean, I remember when the compact was being developed for South Sudan, this was a moment when the leaders of the country were thinking through how much they needed to maintain their political settlement and keep the former enemies in the setup on board. And if anything, the New Deal, in terms of its implications for that conversation, in sending the signal of over-the-horizon support to the authorities at that time, would have been sending the wrong signal to a president who was thinking about how much he needed to keep internal allies on board. So we need these frameworks actually to be much more politically adept to different types of contexts and really connected to the realities on the ground, as well as open to societies coming in, not just the states shaping the framework. One more problem. It's about methodological nationalism. Conflicts cross borders. They're transnational phenomena which are deeply about also local dynamics and borderland economies and political economies that aren't well captured in these nation-state-centric frameworks negotiated between government. So in that sense too, they're not necessarily up to the job. So what we really need to return to is a conversation about what would fix these problems, which is contextual, nuanced, and about getting the people with the power to end conflict to listen to what is in their enlightened self-interest in new ways.
Okay, now we come back to you, the audience. You are going to vote. Open your guidebook apps. We are launching this next vote. You'll notice that even the people on the front are voting. I am voting. Uh-oh, the tides are turning. If you go to the debate, this session, the debate, and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's a question, the polling 2 is open right now. Scroll all the way down to the bottom, and you'll see polling 2 is open right now. Many more votes than the previous one. Looks like we're at about 70 to 30. You've got your work cut out for you, but you're going to have a little time to regroup, and maybe you'll get some reinforcements from those 30 that are out there in the audience, because now we're going to come to you for a question and answer. We have a couple minutes, and I am looking for hands. Joke up here, and I need somebody to run the mic. Okay, Alexandra's got it. Alexandra right here with Joke, and then any other hands in the queue? Yes?
Thank you. That was a great debate. But I am going to attempt to reconcile you. There's no need for belligerence.
It's a peace-building conference.
Yeah. Think about it in the same terms as Fatur Ramadan, the meal that you eat at the end of the day of fasting. If you are in Istanbul or Cairo, you will find that neighborhoods bring their food together into the square and everybody eats together. It's a coalition of the equals. So multilateralism has to be a multilateralism of the equals. If it is about ideas and actions from the global north being imposed on the south, there's no point. So it has to be people from all corners of the globe agreeing that this is what we need. But if it is an imposition, I think there is no middle ground in people of our globe being able to work together for the mutual benefits of all. Thank you.
Over here. Right here.
Thank you. I also want to say, on a positive note, it was a great format of the session, really interactive and, well, focused, swift. My name is Colin Ellison. I'm Secretary General of the organization Parliamentary Forum on Small Arms and Light Weapons. It would be interesting to hear your comment or some argument, because one of the successful factors for making multilateralism relevant and applicable is the possibility to identify synergies between the different frameworks. So I would like to have your comment on this. To give a concrete example, we are working as we are gathering parliamentarians across party political lines to reduce and prevent armed violence with focus on small arms and light weapons. That is a huge obstacle to development and human security. There we have 3 frameworks. For example, Agenda 2030, SDG 16.4, and we have the UN Program of Action relating to small arms and light weapons, and also the Arms Trade Treaty. So we are, of course, focusing on finding synergies between these 3 international frameworks when it comes to the role of parliamentarians to boost the implementation. But what do you think? How can synergies between these frameworks also contribute to a better and improved multilateralism?
Thank you. And there was a question right there in the middle. Navigate to it.
Thank you. Just on the side of multilateralism, we heard a lot about lack of efficacy, which is obviously an argument. But also, I think it's important to acknowledge that uneven application of or hypocrisy with which it's been really implemented, some of the universal standards can also be a very powerful argument. On the other hand, I wanted to actually say that, to my mind, maybe we targeting a wrong thing when we talk about populism and multilateralism. I think, to a large extent, the kind of reaction or the backlash that we see in populism in Hungary, Philippines, UK, or US is not so much against the political globalization as it is against the effects of the economic and to some extent cultural globalization, and the way that national institutional governance systems and transnational ones are capable to deal with the pressures that this particular trends are taking in. So there is a certain lack of credibility in political parties that have been entrenched at the national level in this regard. So that it is not really that these constituencies necessarily vote against New Deal or against the international human rights standards or international humanitarian law. They're really looking at the different type of globalization pressures, and these are just the collateral damage.
Okay, we had 3 quick interventions. I'm now going to return to you. We were recommended to eat as equals.
We were enjoying the audience.
No, this is just summarizing. This is your last ditch argument. And then we'll do one last vote. And then, once we do the last vote to see whether you've been swayed or not, we will come back to the panel and they can give their reflections on Unless you've all exhausted your arguments. Have you exhausted your arguments? That was it? All right. Quick summary in response and using any of this.
Thank you. I mean, we are not arguing. We are just developing consensus on how things can work. From the people's perspective, I was reading a report about Yemen, where the famine, the humanitarian crisis, which is God-made or man-made, cost $2.1 billion to meet those only in 2017. So I was thinking, if you do not have the multilateral system or the multilateral commitment, which country, which one of those great countries or generous countries can meet those needs? This is only in Yemen. So if you ask this question from that family who is suffering in Yemen, that the multilateral commitments do not work, I think you will get the answer from them. Yes, as I said, we can talk about improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of the existing multilateral systems. But looking at these challenges which cannot be solved by one country now, by any of them, whether they're superpower or the poorest country, I think we will fail without multilateral commitments. Thank you.
Okay, so just a few brief points. First to the question of this notion of it being an imposition, of multilateralism being an imposition or imposing templates. And I'm scratching my head and thinking, well, that's not really what multilateralism intends to do or is about. It's really about finding basic consensus on minimum standards. What can we basically agree to at the most, simple level? We're certainly not going to agree to everything, and we can see this in the various commitments that we have, the various agreements. And even where we have like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we know that it's blossomed and evolved in different ways to respond to different whether it's the African Commission on, the African, what's it called? Somebody help me out here. The African Human Rights Treaty, whatever. Anyway.
Commission on Human and People's Rights.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, so there's different, there's different ways that universal treaties are embraced and embellished, and they evolve to respond to different contexts. And I think that's part of multilateralism. So I wouldn't say that it's simply an imposition of one type. And then there's this assumption that I keep hearing that it's somehow we expect it to be perfect, or that multilateralism should work all the time, and that the UN should be able to achieve what we all know, because we work in this field of trying to address very complex crisis situations. It's not easy, right? There's no simple solutions, and we certainly know that bringing leaders together from around the world from very different contexts, trying to get basic agreement on anything. I mean, the fact that the Paris Agreement was achieved is, to be honest, a small miracle, even though we can pull it apart and critique it in many different ways. I think the same can be said of the SDGs. And finally, I think the most important question back to you is really, what is the alternative? Right? What really is the alternative if we do not have any form of multilateralism? Thank you.
And just shortly to add to that, let's not forget that this is for the smaller states as well. It's about leveraging behavior. Commitments is about leveraging behavior on a political agenda. And it's important for countries, despite, regardless if it's Guatemala or Sweden or Cambodia. It's important, and explaining that the weapons of mass destruction is what has kept us safe. Let's not forget that there's a treaty behind trying to regulate the spread of such weapons, and that there is no security guarantees from the countries who control these weapons, obviously. So even though the prevention of a third world war could be explained in such perspectives, it's a very short-term view. The multilateral agenda is long-term, and it's about setting commitments for all, not only for smaller nations, but also for the bigger ones. I would have accepted a lot of the arguments that was pointing to the weaknesses, that perhaps it's setting the wrong goals sometimes. Perhaps 2 degrees Celsius isn't enough to address issues of climate change. Perhaps we're misleading ourselves. Perhaps data that we have available is not sufficient. But it doesn't end there. That calls for more to be done, not less. Thank you.
Okay, so I think from the votes on the screen, you can see that we're already winning. So I try not to ruin our platform by saying too much. But one argument I haven't really made is to pick up on Henrik's points around the functionality of the UN and the plight of accountability within the UN system, controlled as it is by member states who aren't necessarily going to act to make it stronger, because a weak UN serves often their power interests. We are coming off the back of a year. I don't know if you saw the article. I think it sums up a lot of what we've been saying. I love the UN, but it is failing. Senior figures who've spent decades within the UN system trying to push for the right kind of UN, throwing up their hands in despair at the impossibility for whistleblowers in the system to challenge, for example, abuse by peacekeepers, the very people who are sent there to protect vulnerable people and should be the beacons of what multilateralism can do, being effectively unaccountable for that kind of abuse, and the failure of member states to rally around a Secretary General who rightly sought to challenge those kind of issues but was made to seem like a lame duck for so long. So what can we hope for or expect from this version of multilateralism? Of course, multilateralism is needed, but it must be relevant and applicable. And what we have right now, it's not. So I want to finish my remarks with a couple of quotes from Machiavelli, who is often lambasted as a sort of evil character, but has also been acclaimed as someone who was the first person really writing on politics to tell the truth in terms of what shapes events. So 2 quotes. Politics have no relation to morals. Second quote, anyone who desires constant success must change his conduct with the times. So as peace builders, I appeal to you, let's be political and not moralists, and let us keep our tactics up to date with changing times.
Thanks, Larry. I actually wanted to start with a piece of good news, which is that there is, in fact, a Swedish billionaire who is offering £1 million to people who can come up with a new idea of a multilateral system for the future. Because he's seen that the current one is failing so badly that he's offering £1 million to come up with a multilateralism that is relevant and is applicable to today's world. So I think we can at least all put in our bids for that, because that is what we need. We need a multilateralism that is able to really address issues effectively. And I thought your question about synergies maybe pointed to the heart of the problem. Maybe it's people have just lost a sense of reality in an alphabeti spaghetti UN resolution 1352 PQW, and it's all got so removed from our ability to actually deliver concrete change. So maybe it's a dirty word, but maybe populism is a really good thing to be. Maybe it's good to be populist because you have to defend your policies and your strategies on the street, and you'd better be able to show how they are making a difference. And so I think if we could take that populism into really changing the multilateral systems that we have, that could really help take us forward. And I don't really know, to be honest, very much about Yemen, but certainly the Syrians I speak to feel utterly and completely failed by the multilateral system. And they are screaming out for some new system that is relevant and is applicable to today's world.
I'm mindful of the fact that we are over time. So I will just say 6 words. If only we were all equal.
All right, your last vote. This is your opportunity. Open your guidebook app. Scroll down to the bottom of the debate session. Vote yes or no. All right, I have a solution. Oh, you got a solution. Because I don't have time to come back again for everybody to actually clarify their position. So I'm going to tell, once we're done with this, everybody who believes in multilateralism is just stand up at that end. If you're not swayed, you just stand in the middle, and if you're against, you have to stand at this end. Okay, that's good. So it'll be physical that we communicate. All right. Oh, the vote is swayed. It's looking good for pro. There was an argument for multilateralism, not maybe the multilateralism that we have, but the multilateralism that we wish we had. Aspirational multilateralism. Thank you very much. You'll have noticed that you can only vote once. You don't get to vote many times on this. And I appreciate all of your feedback. This hopefully will prompt us to have a lively conversation over coffee. We're not going to have time to go back to the panels to actually clarify their specific positions, but we're going to do it physically. So I'm going to ask them, if you believe in the multilateralism, it's relevant and applicable, stand at that corner. If you're not entirely swayed, stand in the middle. And if you think it just doesn't work, stand over here on this side.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel. Thank you.